Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. And before we get into the absolutely epic Battle of Nations with Napoleon trying to save his nation after the disastrous defeat in Russia around Leipzig, we're going to take a little bit of a pause from there. We're going to go back to Spain with Wellington's triumph, Vitoria, 1813. Now, Spain has been Napoleon's ulcer. It has been a difficult front for him. He hasn't been able to pay much attention to it recently, but it is a constant thorn in his side. And at this point, if I remember correctly, about half of the Spanish territory, which was once claimed by Napoleon, once conquered, so to say, really, has now been lost. And Wellington is going to push up through the Spanish, that's a new word, the Spanish mainland, and take the battle to France's frontiers. So let's have a look at this one. It's a little bit on the shorter side until the Battle of Nations, which is going to be 32 minutes. I'm really looking forward to that one. But let's take a brief pause and have a look at Spain. Yep,
May 1813.
Yeah, so you can see here, right, about half of the territory.
While Napoleon's Grande Armée began its fight back in Central Europe following the disastrous invasion of Russia, 1,200 miles away, at the other end of Napoleon's embattled empire, another enemy was poised to strike. The previous year, Wellington's Anglo-Portuguese army had won a brilliant victory at Salamanca, but been held at Burgos and forced into a long, demoralizing retreat back to the Portuguese frontier.
It's funny too, because like throughout all this, it's like it took a march just back to Portugal, you know, and you look at it on a map, you're like, it's not that far. This is thousands of kilometers that these troops are marching back and forth. And that is one thing that that just blows my mind constantly. The amount of marching that these men did. Like, can you imagine if they had Fitbits, right? And the step counters that some of these troops would have, marching from Burgos all the way back into Portugal, marching from Russia back into modern Germany, like just unbelievable.
But after a winter of rest, reinforcement and training, Wellington's army was stronger than ever. 100,000 men, many of them battle-hardened veterans. And for the first time, he had sufficient cavalry and artillery, while transport and medical services had also been improved. Morale was sky high. Their chief, known to the troops as Old Nosey, was cheered wherever he went. "I never saw the British Army so healthy or so strong," Wellington informed London. In contrast, the French position in Spain was weaker than ever.
And precarious.
Napoleon severely underestimated the threat posed by Wellington, and had just withdrawn 20,000 French troops for his own use in Germany. As Commander-in-Chief, King Joseph knew his forces were overstretched. Napoleon allowed him to give up Madrid and move his capital to the more easily defended Valladolid. But withdrawing further, to a strong position like the Ebro River, was out of the question.
For now.
That would send the wrong message to neutral Austria and Napoleon's wavering German allies. And so, with serious concerns, Joseph and his Chief of Staff, Marshal Jourdan, awaited Wellington's offensive. This video is sponsored by Raid Shadow Legends.
Finally, we went through so many episodes of the Napoleon series and we didn't see any Raid Shadow Legends. That's awesome. Epic History
for
TV
sponsoring this video.
Raid Shadow Legends. I mean, if you don't know what Raid Shadow Legends is by now, I don't even know what to tell you. Man. The Pyrenees before September. Okay.
Wellington's plan was for his army to advance in two wings, concentrate at Toro, then move against Joseph's forces. In the south, Murray's Anglo-Sicilian Spanish force, based in Alicante, had just repelled an attack by Marshal Suchet at the Battle of Castalla. Murray would now mount a diversionary landing on the Mediterranean coast to coincide with Wellington's advance and prevent Suchet sending reinforcements north. Wellington had also counted on large-scale support from Spanish regular forces, of which he was, since November 1812, theoretically commander-in-chief.
I wonder how much of these were the guerrilla fighters that have been obviously waging this war through a couple of years now. I wonder how much of a play there was between the official Spanish army and said guerrilla fighters. Was this the only example that I can think of off the top of my head is the Viet Minh or the Viet Cong and the Vietnamese army itself? I wonder what the play there was between those two organizations. If they even were organizations, some of the guerrilla fighters.
But the Spanish Cortes, based in Cadiz, was deeply divided, with many still highly suspicious of British motives. The result was that Wellington would only receive direct support from a few reliable Spanish divisions. Fortunately, he would receive considerable Spanish support from the guerrillas, now better armed, organised, and operating in greater numbers than ever before.
So I think that answers my question. It seems like they were two separate organizations, so to say.
A large area of Valencia had effectively been liberated by El Fraile, the Friar. Esposimina had captured major towns in Navarre.
I want to know more about that guy.
And was currently keeping General Clausel's Army of the North busy, while Juan Martín Díaz, aka El Empecinado, was tying down large numbers of French troops near Madrid.
These are great names.
On the 22nd of May, Wellington bid farewell to Portugal and began his advance. 4 days later, he was in Salamanca, from where he joined the northern wing of his army under Sir Thomas Graham. Joseph and Jourdan expected Wellington's main thrust to come from Salamanca, so planned to defend the line of the Douro River. But Graham's rapid advance north of the river meant they'd already been outflanked, and they ordered a retreat. By a series of brilliant marches, Wellington continued threatening the French right flank, forcing Joseph to keep falling back.
Maybe someone can help me out here, but what precisely would be a brilliant march? Does that particularly mean the structure in which the troops then were onto their target? Was it more around the organization of the troops? I think a lot of this is actually going to be answered by the Napoleon film and just sort of seeing visually how all this looks, but I'm kind of curious what a brilliant march would really entail. I mean, I can imagine a brilliant march also being, when Napoleon went through the Alps, when Hannibal went through the Alps, but I'm curious what it would mean in this warfare here.
Wellington's army was able to use small roads and mountain tracks north of the main highway, which the French had dismissed as impassable. But thanks to his Spanish allies, Wellington knew better. Backed by British sea power, he was also now able to switch his supply base from Lisbon to Santander, drastically reducing the length of his supply lines, another feat the French had written off as impossible.
Why?
At the Ebro River, the French found themselves outflanked yet again, and fell back to Vitoria. Here, Joseph decided that he must make his stand. The Zadorra River valley west of Vitoria seemed to offer a strong defensive position. Expecting an attack from the west, French forces were drawn up in 3 lines. General Gazon's Army of the South formed the first line, then General d'Erlon's Army of the Centre, then General Rey's Army of Portugal. Joseph hoped that he could at least buy time for the vast wagon convoy assembled east of the city to get away. It contained not only military supplies, but his government's treasury. And, as satirized by this contemporary British cartoon, the accumulated loot of 5 years' French occupation of Spain, including priceless works of art, jewels and antiques. He also expected General Clausel to arrive with 20,000 reinforcements any day. However, thanks to the guerrillas, Wellington was better informed of Clausel's whereabouts than Joseph himself. Knowing that Clausel couldn't reach Joseph before the 22nd of June, he decided to attack on the 21st.
Wow.
The day before, French patrols reported enemy troop movement to the north, so Rey's troops were moved to cover any threat to the army's line of communications. Apart from one division, which left to escort part of the wagon convoy to France. An odd decision that deprived the army of 4,000 men on the eve of battle.
Well, probably because it wanted to protect the convoy, no?
Marshal Jourdan had been bedridden with fever that day. The next morning, he reconnoitred the army's position with King Joseph. They agreed that their position was overextended and should be shortened. But by the time their orders reached General Gazan, it was too late. He was already under attack.
Jeez. Oh, this is not looking good. Oh, this is really not looking good.
Wellington, enjoying the advantage in numbers for once, had decided to attack in 4 columns across a 10-mile front, with General Graham's left-hand column threatening Joseph's line of retreat. It was a bold plan, with the potential to trap and destroy Joseph's army, but required careful coordination and precise timing. Fortunately, the French had not thought it necessary to destroy any of the bridges over the Zadorra River, which was also fordable in several places. At 8 a.m, General Hill's column began its attack on the Allied right. Spanish and British troops advanced up the western heights of Puebla, driving off French skirmishers, and forcing General Gazan to send reinforcements to secure his left flank. Hill's troops then seized the village of Subiana, but French cannon fire and counterattacks prevented any further advance. Convinced that Hill's attack was the main assault, and that troop movements to the north were probably a diversion, Jourdan continued to send troops from the centre to reinforce the left. This was exactly what Wellington wanted. But at 11 a.m, he was waiting with growing impatience for his other columns to go into action. Lord Dalhousie's 7th Division, supposed to be leading the attack by the centre-left column, had got held up in the mountains.
There's a university named after him in Nova Scotia. Fun fact, Dalhousie University.
While further east, Graham's flanking move had got off to a cautious start. But seeing the size of the approaching force, General Rey decided to pull back his troops across the Zadorra River. This encouraged Graham to get things moving. Colonel Longa's Spanish division advanced on Durana, held by Spanish troops loyal to King Joseph, and a bitter struggle for the village ensued. British and Portuguese infantry advanced against Gamara Mayor.
One thing I do kind of wonder is why the Spanish troops that are at this point still loyal to the French, what were their rationale? What were their reasonings for it? Was it just that it had been too long, or was it ideological? Were they already entrenched sort of within this faction, so to say? I'm curious what the Spanish rationale for was with allying with the French.
They were soon engaged in bloody street fighting with the French. This scene shows an attack by the 4th King's Own Regiment of Foot and the 47th Lancashire Regiment. Though they succeeded in driving the French out of the village, they could not cross its bridge over the Zadorra, which was expertly covered by French guns. Around noon, a Spanish peasant informed Wellington that the bridge at Tres Puentes was completely unguarded. He immediately ordered Kempt's elite light infantry brigade to dash across it and secure a bridgehead. But there was still little sign of Dalhousie's 7th Division. General Picton, the notoriously short-tempered commander of the fighting 3rd Division, ran out of patience. Fed up with waiting for Dalhousie, he ordered his men to advance. They charged across the Mendoza Bridge and a nearby ford, driving back light French defences. General Gazan, with his left flank pinned down at Subiana, was now about to be outflanked on his right, and had no option but to pull back his troops.
helping the French, no?
Wellington's army was now crossing the Zadorra River in force. Heavy fighting continued to rage on the heights of Puebla, but here the French also had to give ground to maintain the cohesion of their new line. Scottish Highlanders and Connaught Rangers, supported by riflemen and Portuguese troops, now stormed the village of Arigneth, routing the defenders, who retreated southeast.
So what's funny about those Scottish troops is that even in the I was in the part of the Canadian Army, the Canadian Reserve, should I say, for 10 years, and the Scottish divisions that we have in Toronto, they still wear the kilts and everything like that for their DEUs. So for their dress uniforms, they still basically look like that, even in 2023 in their dress uniforms.
And a gap began to emerge in the French centre, between Gazon's army of the south and d'Erlon's army of the centre. The Allied advance continued, with heavy pressure on both French flanks. Wellington's army appeared to be building unstoppable momentum, with Graham's column poised to cut off Joseph's escape.
Yep. I have a feeling this is going to get...
By 4 p.m, Wellington's army was formed up across the Zadorra, ready to strike a decisive blow. But his infantry came under heavy fire from 76 French guns, blasting great holes in their ranks. Allied guns were brought forward to provide support. The biggest artillery duel of the Peninsular War began. More than 70 guns on each side.
And you can just imagine, too, the smoke that's being generated from these things. It's completely different, of course, to modern artillery. Just the amount of, and just the fog that you would have during this, just absolutely brutal. And again, when the Napoleon movie comes out, I really hope they depict just how foggy this would be, how smoky this would be.
Allied skirmishers, exploiting the gap in the French centre near Gomecha, were able to work their way behind the French guns, shoot down their crews.
Ooh.
Gazon found himself threatened on both flanks.
I don't think that's ever happened in this series, that a small section or a small regiment or anything like this is then able to just sneak right through and kill the crews behind the guns. I don't think that's ever happened in this series. I don't remember something like that. Wow, God, that's... Oof.
But instead of trying to close up with d'Erlon to his north, on his own initiative he ordered a retreat that left d'Erlon's own left flank completely exposed. Around the same time, Longa's Spanish troops finally captured Durana, and rumours swept the French army that their escape route had been cut. D'Erlon's army of the centre fought on bravely, withdrawing to another new defensive line just 1 mile west of Vitoria. French guns kept up a steady fire on the advancing Allied lines, but once more the position was outflanked. Around 5:30 p.m, King Joseph bowed to the inevitable and ordered a general retreat.
Wow, $5 million. Then, too. Don't even know what that would be in.
As the main road to France had now been cut by Longa's Spanish troops, the army would have to retreat east towards Pamplona along a single narrow road with boggy fields on either side. Bad enough for thousands of troops and guns, but there had been no attempt to move off the army's enormous convoy of wagons earlier in the day. The result was pandemonium, as military units and artillery tried to force their way through the streets of Vitoria and the congested lanes and fields beyond. The task of forming a rearguard fell to General Reyes' army of Portugal, which conducted an organised withdrawal covered by its cavalry. Wellington hoped that Graham's column would now be surging across the Zadorra River to cut off the French army's retreat. But Graham, overestimating the enemy's strength, continued to take a cautious approach. East of Vitoria, the French retreat descended into total chaos.
Yep.
The single narrow road became blocked. Wagons that took to the fields got stuck and were abandoned. Allied cavalry fell upon this confused mass, spreading panic and meeting little serious opposition. King Joseph and Marshal Jourdan themselves narrowly escaped capture. Among the abandoned wagons, many civilians, including officers, wives and children, priceless paintings, jewels and furniture, and more than 5 million gold francs. Troops on both sides broke ranks and dived into an orgy of plundering.
Wow.
One British officer described the scene. About dusk, the head of our column came suddenly on some wagons which had been abandoned by the enemy. Someone called out, "They are money carts!" No sooner were the words uttered than the division broke as if by word of command, and in an instant the covers disappeared from the wagons, and nothing was seen but a mass of inverted legs,
like
while the
vultures.
arms were groping for dollars. For money it certainly was. The scene was disgraceful, but at the same time, ludicrous.
Yeah, exactly.
Wellington, however,
completely undisciplined and yet completely understandable, and also a really funny image at the same time.
was furious.
I can only imagine that. Like, I totally get that mentality.
Not only did the plundering delay pursuit of the enemy, but giant sums of cash, which might have paid for his army's supplies, vanished into private pockets instead.
Yep.
Of 5.5 million francs, only 250,000 were ever recovered by the army.
5.25 million francs. Again, no clue what that would be in modern US dollars or modern euros or whatever, but wow, that's just...
Vitoria was a great victory for the coalition. Not as crushing as it might have been, reflected in relatively light French casualties.
Shocking.
But in the chaotic retreat that followed, the Allies did capture all but 2 of 153 French guns, and even Jourdan's Marshal's bateau.
Ouch. Yeah, you know what? I'm kind of surprised with these numbers. The wounded are really, really quite high, but of killed, I thought there would have been more casualties from this, considering the sheer scale of it, but I suppose the fighting, there wasn't that much casualties, but rather it came from it afterwards. But still, 2,824 captured or missing. Significant. Yep. It's one way to cement your
French
reputation.
military power in Iberia was broken. The Bonapartist Kingdom of Spain was at an end. Joseph returned to France to face his brother's criticism. Marshal Jourdan retired from active service. Napoleon sent Marshal Soult to replace them, but even his shrewd military mind could not turn the tide in Spain.
It's over.
Counterattacks to relieve the French garrisons at Pamplona and San Sebastian were defeated. That autumn, Wellington began what proved an unstoppable advance across the Pyrenees and into France.
Wow. Yep. Right there. And that's it. The British are on Napoleon's borders. They're in his country. 1813. That's how long it took.
In southern Spain, where Marshal Suchet remained undefeated, the disaster at Vitoria forced him also to withdraw towards the frontier, leaving behind just a few isolated garrisons. After a bitter 5-year struggle, the Allies had brought the Peninsular War, to the Spanish their War of Independence, to a victorious conclusion. It had been a long, hard road, steeped in blood and suffering. The alliance between Britain and Spain had been particularly treacherous to navigate. But ultimately, both nations had fought together with Portugal to drive the French back across the Pyrenees. New research provides a clearer insight than ever into the huge attrition of French manpower in Iberia. An estimated total of 260,000 lives lost. 3/4 died of sickness, Of approximately 66,000 deaths from combat, 43% were in actions against Spanish regular forces, 38% fighting British-led armies, and 19% fighting guerrillas.
This is the one common thing that I think gets forgotten about a lot. If you look at the American Civil War, for example, the majority of deaths do not come from other human beings. It comes from sickness and disease. And I think that's one thing that in the modern wars that are currently going on, it's not the same as it was before. And look at this, 3/4, 194,000 of 260 were killed by non-human actions, so to say. Obviously not directly as a result of human deaths, but rather from just the disease and the brutal living conditions that some of these troops lived in. 66,000 came from combat. So half of the men that Napoleon marched into Russia with perished in the Peninsular War. Hell of a statistic.
By contrast, British military deaths are estimated at 52,000.
Yeah.
Portuguese 15,000, with many more thousands of civilian deaths, while Spanish deaths are unknown, though the country as a whole may have lost as many as 500,000 lives.
Wow. And again, I'm also curious how much of those came from sickness, how much of those came from disease, how much of them actually came from combat.
5 years of war and occupation. For Napoleon, this disaster had been an unnecessary and largely self-inflicted wound. An intervention born of arrogance and false assumptions.
Yep.
With dire strategic consequences.
Oh, that's an amazingly powerful photo. Let me go back to that quickly.
Dire strategic consequences.
Look at that, just completely balancing on two poles that are gonna. That's a great photo. That's a really great photo.
But as the Napoleonic Empire crumbled in Spain, an even greater struggle neared its climax in Central Europe, where Napoleon faced the most powerful coalition of his enemies yet. If the French Emperor was victorious in Germany, Wellington might soon be scrambling back across the Pyrenees. The fate of Europe was about to be decided at the Battle of Leipzig.
Yep. The Battle of Nations.
Thank you to History March.
Brilliant. What can I say? I love this channel. Thank you all very much for joining me on this one. That was a really great conclusion to that, and that was it. The Spanish War of Independence, at least on the French side, a war of hubris, a war that Napoleon did not have to fight and most certainly lost. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. I cannot wait to the next one, the Battle of Nations, and it's almost coming to a close. There's been tons of episodes of this Epic History TV reaction series. I hope you've been enjoying them so far. Thank you very much for joining me. Take care. See you in the next one for the Battle of Nations.